Shalom and welcome back to the Messiah Yeshua. I'm glad you're here to learn the Word of God with us. Today we're diving into this week's portion, which is called Vayikra. We'll explore its wisdom, its beauty, and we'll see how it speaks to our lives right now. Together we'll look at passages from Leviticus 1:1 through 5:26, which will connect us to Isaiah 43:21 through 44:23, as well as Matthew 5:23 through 30. Let's start with the Torah portion summary. So the cloud of glory which previously covered the top of the Mount Sinai has come down and filled the tent of the meeting. God calls to Moses from within the sanctuary and gives him the laws of the sacrifices. Those desiring to draw near to God are told to bring a gift. The sacrifices consist of various types of kosher animals and offerings of fine flour. These gifts are presented in 5 general classifications of sacrifices: the burnt offering, the grain offering, the peace offering, and the sin offering, as well as the guilt offering. The burnt offering is completely burnt up on the altar. It must be an unblemished male from the herd, such as a bull, or it could be a sacrifice from the flock, such as a sheep or a goat. Even poultry, such as turtle dove or pigeon, could be used for a burnt offering, depending on one's means. The grain offering consists of fine flour offered in combination with oil and incense. The flour offering might be baked or cooked into various types of breads, some of which are burned upon the altar, the rest of which are divided among the priesthood. The peace offerings can come from the herd or the flock. The choice portions of the fats are burnt on the altar, but the priest takes the breast and the right thigh, while the one offering the sacrifice receives the rest of the animal. Sin offerings are brought for purification from unintentional sin or ritual uncleanness, whereas the guilt offering are brought to represent the restitution for misappropriation and sacrilege. The type of animal used for a sin offering depends upon the station of the person offering it, and it can depend upon the person's economic status. The sin offering and guilt offering are typically eaten only by the priesthood. So let's go a little bit deeper into Vayikra. The title Leviticus is derived from the Greek Septuagint version of the Torah. The book of Leviticus is predominantly concerned with the Levitical rituals. An older Hebrew name for the book was the Laws of the Priesthood, but in Judaism today it is referred to by the name of Vayikra, which means "and he called." Vayikra is the first Hebrew word of the book, which begins by saying, "And the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the inside of the tent of meeting," Leviticus 1:1. Leviticus describes the sacrificial service and the duties of the priests. It also introduces ritual purity, the biblical diet, and the calendar of appointed times, laws of holiness, and laws relating to redemption, vows, and tithes. In addition, Leviticus discourses on ethical instruction and holiness. The 24th reading from the Torah is eponymous with the Hebrew name of the book it introduces, Vayikra. This portion introduces the sacrificial service and describes the 5 different types of sacrifices. Is God talking to me? Then the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, Leviticus 1:1. Moses was unusual. God spoke directly to him. He called out to him. Leviticus 1:1 is the 3rd time God calls to Moses in the Torah. Previously, God called to him from the midst of the burning bush and from the midst of the cloud atop the Mount Sinai. At the beginning of Leviticus, he called him from inside of the tent of meeting. The first Messianic congregation I ever attended was influenced by a very charismatic and Pentecostal Christian culture. I was excited to be learning about Torah, but I was often confused by brothers and sisters who frequently and casually reported hearing directly from God. It seemed that Moses would have fit in very well in that congregation. Everyone claimed to be hearing directly from God, and personal prophecies were not uncommon. If God was really speaking to the people in attendance, I did not want to be left out, but I could not escape the feeling that something was amiss. Those who claimed to be hearing from God and reporting His words did not seem to have anything substantive to say. It seemed like God was rambling. Worse yet, occasionally well-meaning congregants would try to help my family out by offering us prophecies that God had given them for us. How Were we to know if these prophecies were genuinely from God or simply self-induced delusions? So I decided to ask one of the Torah teachers about the problem. I asked him, how can I know if God is talking to me? He looked at me quizzically and asked, is he telling you to study the laws of purity and sacrifice in Leviticus? No, I replied. He's not telling me anything. Why do you ask that? The teacher shrugged. If you hear a voice telling you to study Leviticus, it must be God. It took some time before I understood this answer. On the surface, it was a joke. People rarely study Leviticus. It holds little to no interest for the most Christians. Since the destruction of the temple in the days of the apostles, most of Christianity has regarded Leviticus as obsolete. Therefore, if someone had a revelation telling him to study Leviticus, it must be God speaking, because it is not something anyone would make up. Under the surface, the teacher's enigmatic reply was the key to answering my confusion. I took him up on his challenge and began to study the book of Leviticus in depth. It was the first serious Torah study I had ever done. I began in Leviticus 1:1 and followed along in Jewish commentaries as I progressed. I took careful notes, charting out each sacrifice, each procedure, and purpose. I took note of the many instances where the literal text of the Bible seemed to conflict with Christian and or Jewish interpretations. I analyzed the priestly services and their obligations and learned the function of the ordination rites. I faced the difficult concepts of ritual purity and wrestled through that unpleasant material about leprosy, mildews, menstruation, bodily fluids, and purification rituals. The study of Leviticus completely revolutionized my understanding of the Bible and my view of God. After studying Leviticus, I had a new appreciation for the absolute holiness and utter mystery of the Almighty. I realized how dangerous it would be to trivialize an encounter with Him. I came to realize how dangerous He truly is. For the first time, I began to understand how vast the distance between God and man is, and how remarkable it is that such a distance can be spanned in person of Messiah. My newfound respect for the holiness of God gave me a better ability to discern between His genuine voice and the idle chatter of self-proclaimed prophets. The study of Leviticus set me on the path of teaching Torah. Maybe I really was hearing from God. Leviticus contains challenging material. So we will not go very deeply into the complicated laws of Leviticus. Instead, we will try to obtain an overview of the material itself. Heart of the Torah. Then the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, Leviticus 1:1. Leviticus is bracketed on both sides by two books of the Torah. It is the center book, the center of the scroll of Moses. This does not necessarily imply that the material contained in Leviticus is more important than the material in the other books of the Torah, but it does seem to suggest that the material in Leviticus is critical to the structure of the Torah. Bible readers have natural aversion to Leviticus. Genesis is easy to read, it is mostly narrative. Exodus also contains a strong narrative and progression, but Leviticus seems to be mired down in the priestly legal system. A determined reader has set out with the noble goal of reading the Bible from cover to cover, only to find himself derailed somewhere in Leviticus. So the material is complex, obscure, and far removed from our modern religious experience. This does not mean we should ignore it. However, if anything, it suggests that this material demands greater attention. This can be compared to a student learning mathematics. Everything seems to be going fairly well and logically until he begins to learn algebra. Suddenly, the student is dropped into a confusion world of variables where defined numbers are replaced with letters of the alphabet and complex formulas seem to conspire to confound all reason. The young student is tempted to close the textbook in frustration and declares, "I don't want to learn any of this. None of this is relevant for me anyway. When will I ever need to know how to solve a polynomial equation?" On one level, this is true. Depending on the field he chooses, the child might never need to use the complex algebraic equations. Then again, he might. More importantly, algebra lays the groundwork for all higher math and science. In a similar way, Leviticus lays the groundwork for further Bible study. The purpose of the sacrifices. Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when any man of you brings an offering to the Lord, Leviticus 1:2. Why did God institute sacrifices? Why did he not just give people teachings to live moral and upright lives? What is their purpose of killing animals and splashing their blood on altar stones? One common Christian answer has it that the sacrifices were instituted to atone for sin or cover sin until the Messiah came. After Messiah came, his death provided the final atonement, and sacrifices were thereafter no longer needed. This is true inasmuch as Messiah is our final and only sacrifice for sin, but it is not clear that the sacrifices actually took away sins in the past. The writer of the book of Hebrews emphatically teaches that gifts and sacrifices cannot make the worshipper perfect in conscience, Hebrews 9:9, and that it is impossible for the blood of the bulls and goats to take away sin, Hebrews 10:4. Besides, if the blood of the sacrifice was sufficient to take away sin, the death of the Messiah was not actually necessary. Another common Christian answer has it that the sacrifices were only meant to foreshadow the sacrificial death of Yeshua. This is also true, but it is a gross oversimplification. The sacrificial system involved the slaughter of thousands and thousands of animals. It is difficult to believe that God would have imposed the entire complex sacrificial system upon the nation of Israel simply as an object lesson. Judaism has also tried to answer the question of the purpose of the sacrifices. So according to Maimonides, the sacrifices have no real intrinsic value. Maimonides believed that God gave the sacrificial service to Israel after the incident of the golden calf in order to keep them from straying back into idolatry. Since they were prone to drift towards sacrifices and pagan rituals, God thought it be best to give them a sacrificed version of those rituals. According to Maimonides, God ordained the sacrificial system only to provide a substitute for Israel's idolatrous tendencies. Maimonides' explanation is problematic. It does not account for the fact that the sacrifices began in the days of Cain and Abel, long before idolatry or paganism appeared. It fails to account for the sacrifices of Noah and the patriarchal sacrifices. Worse yet, it suggests that God was dealing dishonesty with Israel when he gave them the commandments of the sacrificial system. So a generation after Maimonides, the Torah commentator Nachmanides wrote against Maimonides' opinion. He strongly opposed the notion that the holy sacrifices had been given to Israel only as a substitute for pagan rituals. When it came to explaining the real purpose of the sacrifices, Nachmanides limited them to a more judicial and symbolic function. Like most Christian interpretations, Nachmanides taught that the sacrifices provided an atonement for sin. When a man killed an animal, he considered it as a symbolic payment for his sin. Animals' shed blood represented his own blood. The animal's limbs and organs represented his own. According to this view, when a man offered his sacrifice, he recognized that he himself deserved to die and probably would if God did not accept the death of animal in his place. This interpretation surely has some truth to it. The penalty for sin is death, and the death of the sacrifices represents the payment of that penalty when we attempt to approach the holy God. But this explanation does not solve the enigma of the sacrificial rituals either. Only a few sacrifices are brought for sin. Some are brought as thanksgiving offering, some in fulfillment of vows, and still others just for the privilege of offering sacrifice to God. Let's talk about gifts for God. You shall bring your offering of animals from the herd or the flock, Leviticus 1:2. What gift can you get for the God who already has everything? The real meaning of the sacrifices is found in the root of the Hebrew word for sacrifice. The word is korban. This word is derived from the simple verbal root word karav, which can be translated as to bring near. So in modern Hebrew, the word karov still means to be near something. This implies that the sacrificial system was viewed as means by which the worshipper could draw near to God. The Hebrew word for sacrifice, korban, could be translated as something brought near, or to put it in another way, it could be translated as a gift. So the Israelites were to view the sacrifices as gifts that they could bring to God. Does God need those gifts? Of course not. In Psalm 50, he declares that he is the owner of every beast and the cattle on 1,000 hills. And he says, "If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world is mine, and all it contains. Shall I eat the flesh of bulls or drink the blood of the male goats?" Psalm 50, 12-13. He does not need sacrifices any more than he needs our prayers or our praise. But all three are things that he has enabled human beings to offer to him so that they can enjoy a relationship with him. Of course, not all sacrifices can be thought of as voluntary gifts. Some sacrifices, such as the sin offerings, are mandated. A sacrifice like that should be thought of as a tribute exacted by a great king, whereas the voluntarily sacrifices are like the gifts presented to the king by his loyal subjects. This reading from the Torah describes 5 kinds of sacrifices, each identified by a different name. We will look at each one of these ritual gifts briefly. So we'll start with the burnt offerings. If his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he shall offer it a male without a defect. He shall offer it at the doorway of the tent of meeting, that he may be accepted before the Lord. Leviticus 1:3. The first sacrifice described in this Torah portion is called the burnt offering. The Hebrew word translated as the burnt offering is the word olah, and the word whose root Allah means going up. Perhaps it was called an olah offering because it was completely burned on the altar and went up in flames to God. It was totally consumed with fire, and its smoke rose up to the heavens. Leviticus 1:3 indicates that the burnt offering was a voluntary sacrifice. When a person desired to bring something to God, he was permitted to bring a burnt offering. What was the purpose of a burnt offering? Leviticus 1:4 says that it will make an atonement on behalf of the one offering the sacrifice. Some of the rabbis took this to mean that the burnt offering was supposed to atone for sin. However, Rashi was troubled by this explanation. He noted that the Torah does not specify for which sins the burnt offering is supposed to atone, nor does the Torah ever require a person to bring a burnt offering as recompense for sin. He concedes that perhaps it was meant for sins of omission, but this seems unlikely. If that were the case, why is the burnt offering a voluntary sacrifice? We need a better understanding of what it means for a sacrifice to make atonement. For now, it is sufficient to know that atonement is not the same thing as forgiveness for sins. The burnt offering was not offered for sins, it was offered as a free will gesture. The animals used for burnt offering had to be ritually fit, ritually clean, domesticated, unblemished males. The burnt offering could be brought from the cattle, sheep, goats, or doves, depending on the person's means. The more affluent a person, the larger the animal. The very poor could afford the doves, while the rich could afford the bulls. To get the sense of what it would feel like to bring a bull as a burnt offering to God, imagine buying a new car, parking it in the driveway, pouring gasoline over it, and lighting it up on fire as a gift to God. Or if that would be too expensive, just take a $10 bill out of your wallet and light it on fire. In both cases, the burnt offering feels like a terrible waste. What is to be gained from simply burning something of value? The lesson is that something wasted on God is not wasted. The burnt offering symbolizes a complete and total surrender to God. It stands in the stead of its owner as a token of complete, selfless devotion of one's entire essence. It is a reckless abandonment to God and symbolizes giving one's self, mind, body, and soul over to Him. The Apostle Paul probably had the burnt offering in mind when he wrote to the believers in Rome, encouraging them to live lives of total devotion to God. And he said this, "Therefore, I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. Romans 12:1. Obedience and sacrifice. He shall lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering, that it may be accepted for him to make atonement on his behalf. Leviticus 1:4. In Romans 12:1, Paul urges us to present our bodies as a living and holy sacrifice acceptable to God. What does this mean in practical terms? Is Paul asking us to build altars and literally sacrifice ourselves upon them? Of course not. Paul is using the sacrificial language as an illustration for obedience. He's urging us to set aside our stubborn wills, our wayward flesh, and our self-centered egos and force them to submit to the commandments of God. When we set aside our own personal desires and inclinations for the sake of obeying God, we are sacrificing ourselves for the sake of heaven. Instead of offering a bull, a goat, or a lamb to God as a gift, we are offering ourselves. This is why the prophet Samuel declared that obedience is better than sacrifice. And he says this, "Has the Lord as much delight in burnt offering and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of the rams." 1 Samuel 15:22. Through the prophet Hosea, the Lord declared, "I delight in loyalty rather than sacrifice, and in the knowledge of God rather than burnt offering." Hosea 6:6. Yeshua was fond of quoting this verse to prove that God was more concerned with ethical behavior than perfunctory ritual obedience. This is an important principle for all religious people. Regardless of one's religion, it is always easier to attend to our ritual concerns than to live godly lives. The writer of the book of Hebrews says, "Do not neglect doing good and sharing, for with such sacrifices God is pleased." Hebrews 13:16. Clement, the disciple of Peter, believed that contrition, confession, and prayer were fitting sacrifices acceptable before God. And he said this, "Brethren, the Lord stands in need of nothing. The only thing he wants from anyone is that confession be made to him." David, the chosen one, says in Psalm 69:30-31, "I will confess unto the Lord, and it will please him more than a young bull with horns and hoops. Let the poor see it and be glad." And again he says in Psalm 50:14-15, "Offer unto God the sacrifice of praise, and pay your vows to the Most High. Call upon me in the day of thy trouble. I shall rescue you, and you will glorify me." For Psalm 51:17 says, "The sacrifice of God is a broken spirit." And that's from 1 Clement 52:1-4. In today's world, there is no tabernacle or temple in which a person might offer a sacrifice. If we desire to give God a gift today, what can we give him? We can give no better gift than our own humble submission to his will. We can give him the simple sacrifice of grateful obedience. We can give him the contrition of our hearts and the prayers of our lips. A soothing aroma. The priest shall offer up in smoke all of it on the altar for a burnt offering, an offering by fire of a soothing aroma to the Lord. Leviticus 1:9. As the Torah describes the sacrificial service, it says that when the smoke of the offering rises to heaven, it will be a soothing aroma to the Lord. Leviticus 1:9. At first this seems strange. Does God really like the smell of burning meat? Rashi interprets the soothing aroma as a metaphor for man's obedience. He explains that the aroma of the sacrifice is pleasing to the Lord because it is a token of his children's obedience. When God smells the aroma of the sacrifice, he says, "I have given commandments and my will has been obeyed." Again, as cited above, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of the rams. 1 Samuel 15:22. In the same line of a thought, the pleasing aroma of sacrifice symbolizes God's acceptance of man's gift. Remember that the sacrifices are intended as ritual gifts to the Almighty. When God smells the sacrifice, He delights in the human being who has gone to such effort to draw close to Him. Regardless of how we understand it, the Torah is clear that God takes delight in the sacrifices. He graciously accepts the gift of His people, and the smoke that rises from the altar fires as a soothing aroma to Him. This seems difficult to reconcile with many statements in the prophets where God speaks out against the sacrifices. For example, in the book of Isaiah, He says, "I have had enough of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fat cattle, and I take no pleasure in the blood of bulls, lambs, or goats. Bring your worthless offerings no longer." As say Isaiah 1:11-13. Likewise, in the book of Jeremiah, He says, "Your burnt offering are not acceptable, and your sacrifices are not pleasing to me." Jeremiah 6:20. In the book of Malachi, He says, "If only you might not uselessly kindle fire on my altar, nor will I accept an offering from you." That's Malachi 1:10. In the early days of Christianity, the church fathers often cited texts like these to try to prove that God had never wanted a sacrificial system. Some used these and similar passages to suggest that God had given the sacrifices to the Jews as a punishment, even. They argued against the Jewish people, claiming that Jesus had done away with the sacrifices because God had always hated them. That does not make any sense. If God always hated the sacrifices, why did He command the children of Israel to bring them in the first place? Why did He state over and over that He was pleased with them? A better explanation comes from a more careful reading of the prophets. When the prophets seem to speak against the sacrificial system, they are not condemning the mode of worship, they are condemning the worshippers themselves. In every instance, the prophetic rebuke is directed toward the immoral, disobedient people among the Israelites who were violating the covenant of Torah while continuing to go through the motion of the sacrificial system. Though their hearts were far from God, they continued to perform their religious rituals. This can be compared to a wicked womanizer who beats his wife and cheats on her, but continues to faithfully attend church every Sunday and take communion with the rest of the congregation. The religious ritual is meaningless and an insult to God. Or suppose the same fellow, after beating his wife and cheating on her, dutifully sends her a bouquet of roses. Would she be pleased to receive the flowers? Hardly. She would say, "Your flowers are an abomination to me." In the same way, God hates the religious rituals when they're performed hypocritically. These lessons should be a warning to all of us. We must be careful not to develop any sense of right standing with God because of ritual observances. God is interested in the state of our hearts. Our outward rituals should reflect our inward conditions. Now we'll talk about the grain offerings. Now when anyone presents a grain offering as an offering to the Lord, his offering shall be of fine flour. Leviticus 2:1. The offerings are best understood as ritual gifts given to God. The grain offering is the second type of gift that the Torah describes. The term grain offering is a descriptive but not literal translation. The translators refer to it as grain offering because it was made of fine flour. Some older English versions of the Bible translate it as the meal offering, actually, or a cereal offering. Ironically, the King James Version translated as meat offering. King James readers beware, there is no meat in that meat offering. The grain offering is the only vegan sacrifice in Leviticus, so why does the King James Version call it the meat offering? In King James English, the word meat did not mean flesh, as it does in modern English. The word meat referred to food in general. The Hebrew word used here does not mean the grain offering or meat offering. It is the word mincha. Like the word korban, the word mincha literally means gift or tribute. In Genesis 43:11, Jacob advised his sons to take some of the best products of the land in your bags and carry down to the man as a present, mincha, a little balm and a little honey, aromatic gum and myrrh, pistachio nuts and almonds. Therefore, the grain offerings should be translated as gift offerings. Like a burnt offering, the mincha offering was not for a penalty for sin. It was a free will gift to God, completely voluntary on the part of the person offering it. The basic components of the mincha offering were grain, usually as wheat flour, oil, and frankincense. Like the matzah at Passover, the grain offering were unleavened. Leaven was regarded as a symbol of fermentation and corruption. The grain offering could be baked in an oven, fried in a pan, deep pan fried, or left uncooked. Grain offerings were brought to the altar in conjunction with other types of sacrifices like burnt offerings and peace offerings. The grain offerings were brought by poor people who could not afford other types of sacrifices. One Talmudic parable sees this as a potential explanation for the variety of grain offerings described by the Torah. It can be compared to a human king for whom his friend wanted to prepare a feast. The king knew his friend was poor and could not afford a variety of expensive foods like those to which the king was accustomed. The man could only afford flour. The king did not want the man to feel badly, so when he accepted the man's dinner invitation, he told his friend, "Do you know what I would like to eat? I would like you to prepare 5 different kinds of breads for me." And that you'll find that in Menachot 104b. So the Torah says that every grain offering was to be salted with salt before being placed upon the altar in order to symbolize the salt of the covenant of your God, Leviticus 2:13. Salt was used in an ancient world as preservative. The salt of the covenant refers to the unchanging and eternal nature of God's covenant with Israel. Just as salt preserved foods from turning rancid, God's faithfulness preserves his covenant with his people. To this day, at every Shabbat table, the observant Jewish family dashes a little salt on Sabbath bread or dips the bread into salt before eating it because the Talmud says a man's table is like the altar. Peace offerings. Now, if his offering is a sacrifice of peace offering, if he is going to offer it out of the herd, whatever male or female, he shall offer it without defect before the Lord. Leviticus 3:1. The third type of gift introduced in the Torah reading is the shalamim, the peace offering. They are called peace offerings because the Hebrew word shalamim is related to the word shalom, which means peace. Like the burnt offering, the grain offering, the peace offerings were voluntary. There were different types of peace offerings. So there was a thanksgiving offering, votive offerings, free will offerings, and Passover lambs were all peace offerings, sacrifices in which the one bringing the animal partook. They were never brought as a penalty for sin or to earn forgiveness for sin. The peace offering had to be an unblemished animal from the herds or the flocks, but it was prepared differently from the burnt offering. Only the choice fats were burned upon the altar. The rest of the sacrifice was divided between the person who brought the peace offering and the priest who offered it on the altar. The peace offering was an opportunity to share in the table of the Lord. It symbolized a shared meal between the offerer, the priesthood, and God himself. The peace offering represented peace and mutual goodwill between God and the person bringing the peace offering. It represented fellowship between God and man. The meat of the peace offering was to be used for fellowship meal. The man who brought the offering would invite his whole family, friends, and acquaintances to partake of his feast. Peace offerings were usually offered in conjunction with the festivals. Families would travel together to Jerusalem, offer their peace offerings, and then enjoy them together as a component of keeping God's appointed times. Maybe that's where the tradition of big festival meals actually comes from. Where are the sin offerings? If a person sins unintentionally, that's a very important word, unintentionally, in any of the things which the Lord has commanded not to be done, and commits any of them, Leviticus 4:2. So far, we have learned 3 of the 5 types of offerings. Have you noticed that none of them were penalties for sin? Instead, they were intended to be ritual gifts that a person could give to God out of a glad and willing heart. The remaining two types of sacrifices are concerned with sin, the sin offering and the guilt offering. So before we begin to study them, we should take note of how the Torah defines sin. Leviticus 4:1 says that a person sins when he does any of the things which the Lord has commanded not to be done. Leviticus 4:2. The converse is also true. A sin is a failure to do anything that the Lord has commanded to be done. To put it simply, sin is breaking God's commandments. Sin is a translation of a Hebrew word chata. It's pronounced as hauta. This word is an archery term. It means to miss the mark. A sin is like an arrow that falls short of its intended target. As Paul says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God," Romans 3:23. So the word Torah is also derived from an archery term. The root word yara means to take aim. The Torah is the target for which we are to aim. Sin is a matter of falling short of that target. Leviticus 4:1 says that even an unintentional transgression of God's commandments is a sin. And now we'll take up the actual sin offering. If the anointed priest sins so as to bring guilt onto the people, Leviticus 4:3. The Hebrew word translated as sin offering is chatat, is almost identical to the word for sin, which is chata. So depending on who sinned, the Torah prescribes several different types of sin offerings. If the high priest sins, he must bring a bull. If the whole community sins, elders representing the community must bring a bull. If a leader like the king sins, he must bring a male goat. If an Israelite sins, he must bring a female goat or a lamb. If he cannot afford the goat or lamb, he can bring a pair of doves. If he cannot afford the doves, he can bring flour. The ritual procedures for the sin offering differ depending on which type is brought. Paul teaches that sin is a condition common to all men. He says all have sinned, Romans 3:23. The book of Ecclesiastes says, "Indeed, there is not a righteous man on earth who continually does good and who never sins," Ecclesiastes 7:20. The Torah seems to illustrate the same concept here, assuming that not only the common people sin, but also the king, the elders, and even the anointed holy priest. So knowing that everybody sins, it can be tempting to wink at one's own moral failings, to shrug and say, "Oh well, no one's perfect, everyone sins." The laws of the sin offering illustrate the gravity of sin. Disobedience to God's commandments is a serious matter, not something to be discarded with a cavalier attitude. Even unintentional sins are regarded so seriously that a sacrifice must be brought to repair the relationship. However, the sin offering was not a penalty for sinning. Instead, it was a means of spiritual purification after sin had been dealt with, repented, and forgiven. The sin offering was not brought only for sin, it was also brought in connection with ritual purification. As with the other sacrifices, it is best to regard the sin offering as a gift to God. For the person who had sinned, it was sort of an apology gift. It did not earn forgiveness, but it was an appropriate gesture to make. And now we'll talk about the guilt offering. He shall also bring his guilt offering to the Lord for his sin which he has committed, a female from the flock, a lamb or a goat as a sin offering, so that the priest shall make atonement on his behalf for his sin. Leviticus 5:6. The guilt offering, the fifth type of sacrifice in our reading, is similar to the sin offering. In Hebrew, it is called the asham, a word that can be understood to mean indemnity or reparation. The guilt offering differs from the sin offering in that it is prescribed primarily for the offenses that require a payment of restitution. It seems to be a type of penalty. When a person committed a sin, like misappropriation of someone else's property or misuse of sacred objects, he was required to pay reparations and bring a guilt offering. The Torah says that he was to repay the full amount of damages plus 1/5 and then bring a guilt offering. The implication is that an offense toward another person is also an offense toward God. When we cheat or damage or misuse someone else or their property, it is as if we have cheated, damaged, and misused God. Therefore, when we settle accounts, we must repay the victim and we must repay God. The reparation made to God is the Hashem, the guilt offering. So the Torah does not say that the sacrifice takes away the sin, but it does say that if a man confesses the sin, repents, makes reparation, and seeks atonement before the Lord, he will be forgiven for any one of these things which he may have done to incur guilt. Leviticus 6:7. Thereby, the sacrificial system, though not the actual mechanism for removing sin, it provides a beautiful picture of cleansing from sin while foreshadowing the coming of the Messiah, whose death would serve as a heavenly sacrifice for sin. And let's talk about the lessons from the sacrifices. We'll start with Leviticus 6:7. The priest shall make atonement for him before the Lord, and he will be forgiven for any of these things which he may have done to incur guilt. This has been only a brief overview and introduction to the sacrificial system. Nevertheless, even on the superficial level of study, we have learned several new things about the sacrifices. So the different types of sacrifices have different meanings. Not all of the sacrifices are sin offerings, and most of the sacrifices are more like gifts than penalties. Studying the sacrifices also reminds us that the God we worship does not always fit well into our conception of what he should be like. The God of the Bible is a God who took delight in the slaughter of sacrificial animals and described the smoke that rose from his altar fires as a soothing aroma. Though he certainly had no need of their tribute, he invited his followers to serve him with gifts by slaughtering bulls, goats, and rams. The sacrificial system reminds us that God is a strange and untamed God, utterly holy and removed. He is so completely other that the one who wanted to enter into his holy tabernacle could do so only by means of the blood of the sacrifices. Moreover, human sin is so grievous to God that it cannot be left unaddressed, even if the sin was inadvertent. Even an unintentional sin required a sin offering, and a sin against another person required reparation and sacrifice. Who has a chance of standing in the final judgment before such exacting God? The good news is that through the sacrificial death of God's Son, we can be washed of sin, cleansed, and forgiven. And that's it for today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I know this parsha has been a little bit too complicated in a way, but I hope we broke it down very well, and I hope everybody got blessed by the message. And if you did, please like the video and subscribe, as it does help for the message to reach more people who need encouragement and truth. And feel free to follow our Instagram, linked in the comments for daily inspiration, as well as daily prayer. May God bless you and keep you. May he shine his light on you and be gracious to you. May he turn towards you and grant you peace. Grace and shalom to you all.